Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to talk while I share my screen. My name's Teresa, as Erin said, and for the past 2 years, I've served as the Director of Faith Formation at St. Ignatius Parish in San Francisco. For those of you that do know me, today's actually my last day as a full-time director. I'm jumping into high school teaching. So it's great to be with you all on what is my last full day and presenting on a project that I absolutely love. So let's just jump into it. If I could figure out how to move my slide. Oh, there we go. So this is an overview of our Discernment Series, Racial Justice. It was a 20-week online program with 2 newsletters going out a week. And it used the spiritual exercises as a framework for discerning how to work for racial justice in one's own life. We had over 1,000 participants from across the country and about 200 parishioners at St. Ignatius. So a little background information as to why this program started. The catalyst had really been George Floyd's murder in the summer of 2020. Like much of the nation, our parish was grappling with the horrific nature of his death and the kind of rising calls for Black Lives Matters for the past several years. As a staff, we knew we had to respond in some way and didn't quite know how to do that since we were all on Zoom and virtually streaming our masses. And we came up with the idea that George Floyd's murder was the action of one individual, but all the circumstances that led to that was a collective and societal and like a cultural thing. I can't think of the word, I'm sorry. But they're basically saying that there was a lot more that went into this man's murder than just an individual action. And then the filming of it and the release of that video. So we decided that our pastor, Father Greg Bonfilio, would lead the community in kneeling for 8 minutes and however many seconds, the time that they said that George Floyd had a knee on his neck that led to his death. And so those of us in the church who were there working the mass knelt during the opening prayer, I think during the penitential, I'm not a liturgist, penitential act. And then asked everyone at home to do the same. And what we heard was that it was really moving. It's a really long time to stay on your knees and in silence. And from our parishioners, we just got this outpouring of messages saying, what can we do? Like this was this moment and this physical act has awakened something in me that is causing me to want to go deeper and do more. So things were kind of popping up around the parish. We had created a little like reading list for people who are interested, but it was clear that we needed to do something more. And a little more background, St. Ignatius is structured in this way that I've outlined on our screens. So we have a parish council, which is made up of representatives from our 5 different commissions. And those commissions are admin, community, faith formation, mercy and justice, and worship. So every month we have a 2-hour meeting with the commission members to talk about programming, to set goals for the parish, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a meeting where it was tasked that faith formation and mercy and justice would work together to kind of come up with some sort of response to race and racism. It was actually a member of the Mercy and Justice Commission who came back at the end of that meeting and said, actually, this is a parish-wide project. It can't just fall under one commission. We have to look at every aspect of the church to help with the initiative is such a small way of saying it, but to really take a look at ourselves and the programming that we do throughout all aspects of the parish. So in the summer of 2020, the commissions and the staff read 2 books. The first was Racial Justice in the Catholic Church by Brian Massengale. And then each commission were given chapters of how to be an anti-racist that pertained most to their area in the parish. And then Father Greg hosted a number of listening sessions amongst the leaders of the parish and the staff. And that led to the formation of the Anti-Racism Committee. Each member of the commission has a representative on this committee, as well as a couple of other members from the parish. So we have a woman who's a parishioner, and she also works at the University of San Francisco, where we sit on. And that led to the development of an anti-racism strategic plan. So myself and a Jesuit, Lucas Sharma, who does this work for the West Coast province, work together to kind of, in prayer and through discernment, come up with the anti-racism strategic plan that was then sent out to all the leaders of the parish for edits and feedback. And we went through several iterations of it before we adopted this one. So our vision is that St. Ignatius will be an anti-racist, multicultural parish where people of diverse identities, including race, gender, sexual orientation, and others will experience a safe community faithful to the gospel call of Jesus Christ. And we specifically chose the word anti-racist over racial equity or racial justice because of our reading of How to Be an Anti-Racist from Ibram X. Kendi. And in that book, he really says that that to be an anti-racist means to kind of actively work towards racial justice and work towards combating racism. And his description of it was saying that in one moment you can be a racist by upholding policies, procedures that support a racial class divide. And in the next moment, you can be an anti-racist where you're dismantling or taking down those same structures. What struck us was that it's very similar to discernment in thinking about what in this moment leads us closer to God or what in this moment leads us further away from God. And how can we use discernment to affect our actions? So under the vision, we created 5 goals that relate to our 5 commissions. And the first is cultivating community conversion and deepening relationships. The next is diversifying liturgy, prayer, and worship. The third is educating our community. The fourth is evaluating policies, practices, and procedures. And the 5th is expanding outreach. So goal 3 is the area that my department and my commission oversee, and that's educating our community. And in our conversations, we, the commission in total, kind of narrowed in on individual conversion and collective action. And kind of those are the two ingredients for effective anti-racism work. So that leads us to the development of the Discernment Series, Racial Justice. In our conversations with each other, amongst each other, someone said, actually, the gospel is an anti-racist message. It's one of love and welcoming others, and there's countless stories in there where Jesus, in his actions or in his parables, are expanding what it means to be community, what it means to be neighbor, who's included, constantly throughout the Gospels. And then another member said, well, you know, the framework of the spiritual exercises in its 4 weeks is a really great framework, a really great guiding path for reflection. So it starts off, for those of you who are not familiar with the spiritual exercises, the first week is really focusing on God's love and us individuals as loved sinners. So we were created out of love. We have what's like our purpose in life is what St. Ignatius wrote as the first principle and foundation, which is to basically love God, love ourselves, and serve others. The second week looks at the incarnation and life of Jesus. The third week looks at the passion, and then the fourth week looks really to like culminating in all the other weeks and ends with the contemplation to attain love. So it's all about love in our actions and what we can do in our lives. So the goal of the Discernment Series was to help guide parishioners through an educational and spiritual reflection on race in the United States, so that they can discern for themselves how to work for racial justice in their own lives. To be able to identify and define racism so as to work toward dismantling it, and to be able to identify and describe the movements of the Spirit to work toward following her. And ultimately, the hope was that participants would commit to one concrete action at the end of the program. So this is the method of how we created it. We paired the spiritual exercises with a historical, sociological, and theological understandings of race and racism in the United States. We collected registration. We casted a wide net, which is why we had around over 1,000 participants. ISN was nice enough to promote it. So thank you guys. And then we sent 2 emails weekly, and we'll look in a little bit what those emails look like. And so we had 2 writers producing this work. It was Lucas Sharma, who's that Jesuit, brilliant man, and then myself. And then it was edited by our Director of Communications, Robert Nolan, and our Senior Director of Operations, Larry Simi. So it was a really collective and collaborative effort. So the 2 newsletters followed this format. Again, weeks, talking about the weeks of the exercises, not pertaining to the 7 days that we think of normally as a week. So the Monday newsletter for week 1 looked at the reality of evil and forgiveness. And the Wednesday newsletter for week 1 reflected on provided reflections on how we are loved sinners in a broken world. And then week 2 looked at basic definitions to engage in conversations about race. And then in the reflection, there were meditations on the incarnation and life of Christ. Then in week 3, we took a little bit of a broader perspective and looked at racism in the church, in the AAPI community, in the Latinx community, and the Indigenous community. And that was coincided with, we followed the liturgical calendar, and that coincided with Lent. So week 3 was meditations on the passions of Christ. And then week 4, since it's about love and action and more hopeful, we looked at examples of racial justice works in the Jesuit network. And then our reflection for week 4 were on the gospel passages of reconciliation. And then it ended with the contemplation to attain love, which is a contemplation to love like God loves, letting that infiltrate our heart and mind. So I'm going to show you an example of what a Monday newsletter looked like and what a Wednesday newsletter looked like. So for this first one, we're going to look at issue 9, which is racism operates through all our social institutions. So each newsletter has a photo or image at the beginning, has a little description here about where we are in the exercises and connecting it from one to another. And then we write about the topic. So this is kind of an example of how we wrote how it works in institutions. I focused on housing, ultimately on housing and home ownership. And then we linked to a lot of resources. We often quote theologians like Greg Boyle, Brian Massengale, M. Sean Copeland. Those are kind of like the main sources that we pulled from, but also other primarily Black theologians, aside from Greg Boyle and Pope Francis. And then we provided a resource. So this was an America Media Jesuitical podcast. And then we ended with reflection questions for people to think about and digest what they just learned. And then this is a Wednesday newsletter. This is the meditation on the 2 standards. We begin with a quote by Pope Francis, a little bit of an explanation. And then this is, so explanation about sorry, I haven't seen this in a while, about the exercise. Here's another resource. And then here's the meditation. And we ask people to take about 20 to 30 minutes to pray with this. And we'll go through this in a truncated version a little bit later, but this is kind of what it looked like. And then St. Ignatius was big on thinking about and reflecting on our prayer experience. So we have questions at the end to guide that. So then we had reflection groups, which we didn't initially think about having, honestly, because of a bandwidth issue. Lucas and I just did not have the time to write all of these newsletters and also coordinate a reflection group. But there was a lot of inquiries into that, especially from our parishioners. So we set up 2 or 4 reflection groups of primarily St. Ignatius parishioners. We had 2 facilitators per group. Our hope was that we had one that was more well-versed in spiritual direction, and then one that was more well-versed in the educational aspect. And they met 4 times throughout the series. And the feedback that we had at the end of the program was that folks wanted the reflection groups to start earlier. So had we had the forethought to do it, we would have asked folks to enter into reflection groups. They wanted to meet more often as well, because this is a lot of heavy material. But what we heard also was that that was some of the most meaningful and powerful moments in the program, was getting to talk and reflect and pray with other people. And we were pleasantly surprised by how vulnerable folks got so quickly and only over the course of 4 sessions. So here are some tips for using the Discernment Series Racial Justice in your own parish. Much of this is what we learned, and that's to create small groups early on and have members commit to staying with one another throughout the whole series. There were some kind of group jumping depending on availability, and what we heard was that really disrupted the flow and kind of the safe space nature of the group. So if they could commit to each other to stay throughout the series, that's the ideal. And then the two facilitators really really helped, again, in having one who was more versed in spiritual direction and one who was more versed in kind of racial justice, racial equity work. If that's not possible, then just having two facilitators to kind of bounce off of each other. We're asking people to enter into a really vulnerable and scary space. So having two people who would guide the group just helps maintain that structure. Each group, we gave a facilitator guide out with some guidelines, but ultimately each group created their own guiding principles for how they wanted to act as a community and what rules and what that they wanted to include and what rules they didn't. And ultimately expect pushback. You know, we were really nervous before we started this series, especially because we're a predominantly white parish in San Francisco, and like all parishes, we rely on parishioner donations to operate. And so the fear was that some of our wealthier white parishioners would pull back from the parish because of our work. And our pastor, Father Greg, ultimately said, after many conversations, that this is something important and that he's willing to lose parishioners over. And shockingly, we didn't have that much pushback. We did have people respond to individual newsletters with being upset about individual newsletters, and then we also received positive feedback, and for us that showed us that we were really kind of pitching over the plate, that it wasn't heavily tipped towards negative feedback, and it wasn't heavily tipped towards positive feedback. So I say, if you're going to do this, stand your ground and don't shy away from it for fear of what other people might think or how they might react, because people will surprise you. And ultimately, don't reinvent the wheel. We've already done the hard work. I think we created a really great series with really well thought out newsletters. I've received a number of inquiries about how to create your own discernment series in a parish, and I think that's great work. And if you want to go ahead and do it, but it's exhausting. It was really a marathon of creating these newsletters, and it took a lot of emotional work and mental work as well. So we've already done it. So if you want to just use ours, that's totally fine. And then here are some ways that you can potentially modify the retreat. You can expand it into 40 weeks. I know that sounds a lot. That's a majority of the year. But a response was that 2 weeks of really heavy material was a lot. And some people would have rather had a longer retreat. If you are short on time, you can focus on one of the weeks, and they kind of vary in length. I think the second week of the exercises is the longest, between 6 and 8 weeks. So I say, if you're going to do that, then focus on the second week. Maybe include an introductory piece from the first week, but focus on kind of the definitions basic definitions of like what is racism, what is anti-racism, what is white supremacy, what is white privilege, etc. So folks can engage in the conversations that are happening across the nation. Another idea is to work through in a cohort model. So having maybe 5 to 10 folks at a time go through the retreat. And so maybe one group starts in January and then another group starts in February, and they're all at different paces, but they're kind of happening at the same time. And then there is the possibility of truncating the retreat into 6 weeks. I'd have to think really and be really intentional about what to include in that, but that's a request that I've received. So I think it's possible, but this is my baby, so I would say it's not ideal to truncate it, but it's possible. So now it's time for questions and answers, and then I'll lead you through a reflection and we'll have small group conversations. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, and Erin or Brenna will read out any questions that folks have. I just kind of powered through that, so feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, feel free to continue dropping them in the chat. Teresa, right now, one of the questions is in regard to how to access those resources in the series, which I do think you'll get into later. But.
Yeah, so right now, they are all on our website, and I'll get into this in a little bit. I'll throw up the website link, but just to show you what it looks like, we're currently in the process of compiling it all into one document, so you don't have to click through all these different newsletters, and then also creating a facilitator's guide. There's just been, again, it's an issue of bandwidth. We're a small we're a small staff for a big parish, so we're trying to do as much as we can, but not burn ourselves out. So I'm just going to share what this looks like. This is the web page that you'd go to. I'll drop the link in the chat a little bit later. It explains our work in the series, and then we've archived all of the newsletters that we've sent out. So feel free to kind of click on them, and then it'll take you there.
There are multiple notes about how remarkable the generosity that you're offering and sharing these newsletters and all your work is. So just note that too as well. One of the questions is, was there any particular facilitator training?
There was not, and that is something that we looked into, but the people who signed up to facilitate were folks who were kind of well-versed in doing group work. So we didn't need to have that training. But I think if there were people who wanted to go ahead and be a facilitator, but haven't had the experience of leading a group, or maybe talking about racial justice, there are trainings out there that can lead people kind of through the one-on-ones, and also how to create safe spaces. When we compile this facilitator's guide, I'll make a note to add those to our document.
Okay, we have lots of good questions here. Someone asked if you could share a little bit more about the parish demographics at St. Ignatius, how big it is, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not a numbers person, so I can't tell you how many registered parishioners there are. I'm a theology person. I don't deal with numbers. But I know we have about 800 active parishioners. That's the amount that we typically see on a weekend, 800 people at all of our masses. And it's predominantly white I would say the next group would be Asian, kind of given our location and our status as a Jesuit parish. A lot of people commute to us, come to us because we're a Jesuit parish. A lot are alumni of Jesuit institutions, and then people come from the area. So the area is a predominantly white neighborhood, and then you go a little east, you go a little west, and it's a predominantly Asian neighborhood. So I wish I had hard numbers, but I don't. That's kind of what I see at our parish.
Regarding the small groups or the reflection groups, could you elaborate a little more on format, how long each meeting was? Did those take place by Zoom, and approximately how many people were in each group?
Yeah, I think approximately 6 people were in each group. The format and the length kind of varied from group to group. We had suggested to do an hour-long session, and then had some basic guidelines about respecting one another and confidentiality. But they really kind of took on a life of their own. So some people met for an hour and a half. Some people stuck to the hour. So the groups were kind of individualized in a lot of ways that we didn't expect because of the how the group was comprised. And they met all on Zoom since this happened during the pandemic.
Could you share anything that was done to get more people engaged in the discussion so as to not continue preaching to the choir?
Nothing intentional other than just putting it out there. Yeah, that's a good question. We just put it out there and asked folks to sign up. So whoever did.
When you and the leadership team were putting the program together, did you have specific desired or expected outcomes from the program?
Yeah, our desire was to create an kind of an outstanding educational program so that people could engage in conversations, the larger conversations that are happening around the country, especially in organizing spaces. A thing that I faced was a bit of censorship. There was some fear from some white people on our staff that that folks would be turned away by speaking of white supremacy or white privilege or using a term like anti-racism. But ultimately our team decided that we needed to say that, we needed to use those words, white supremacy, white privilege. And if not, then we would be doing a disservice to the people in the program, because those are terms and definitions that you need to know to thoughtfully and critically engage. So that was one aspect. And then the other aspect is that there would be some spiritual transformation. And really, at our parish, we really believe in the work of the Spirit and how she kind of calls us to being and calls us to life. So really trusting the Spirit and as she guided each individual.
Thanks, Teresa. A few people have asked similar questions about, after completing the Discernment Series, what are future action steps that the parish has identified, if any?
Yeah, that's a really great question. The Discernment Series, again, was one part of the strategic plan, and just one part of one part. The challenge that we're facing now is what to do next. And there's a lot of conversations in the different commissions about how how to be and how to respond, and how to work towards our goals. So actually the anti-racism committee right now is reading a book by Joseph Barnt, How to Become an, I don't have the book in front of me, or maybe I do. Becoming an anti-racist church, journeying towards wholeness. This is what the book looks like. So we're reading this and thinking about how we can apply some of his work and the experiences that he's had into our own parish life. So one example that our community commission is thinking of is just hosting a movie series that highlights different cultural and ethnic backgrounds and experiences. Something that we noted was that Pixar is doing a lot of great work showing different cultures right now, and so maybe pulling from that, from their work. Sorry, that's my dog.
Okay, lots of questions. I'm trying to keep up. There are two somewhat related, winding back to the very beginning, people asking about how did you first publicize or share with your community what the Discernment Series was? Sort of how did you message it?
Sorry, I'm trying to see if he's gonna bark again. Sorry, he's very territorial and there's someone in the hallway. But basically, we promoted it through our regular channels of pulpit announcements and newsletter. I spoke at the end of a couple of masses just to explain what we were doing. And then we just put it out to different networks. Again, ISN promoted it and wrote a little story about what we were doing. US Catholic did a little story on it. Jim Martin promoted it. So we had different avenues in which we reached people for signups, and then we just kind of let it out into the world and just waited to see who would sign up.
These questions I really appreciate. Somebody asked about the racial breakdown of attendees, and then within the small group reflections, if you could speak to how much labor was undertaken by BIPOC members, if there were instances where white members expected too much from others in the groups in terms of mental labor and educating them, and how those instances were handled.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't have a demographic breakdown of the participants. We just didn't ask. And there were conversations about whether we should or we shouldn't, and ultimately decided against it. In terms of the BIPOC members of the reflection group, that's a really, really great question. I wasn't a part of any of them, so I can't speak directly to how that was or was not handled. But in the guide that we had sent out, which is not the guide that we would publish because there's a lot that we've learned since then. But it was focused on letting people speak from their own experience and not speak over each other or ask, kind of like ask questions. We really followed like a communal discernment format for those groups. Whether or not they followed it, I'm not sure. But just an anecdote about asking BIPOC to do the emotional labor. Just to note, myself and Lucas are people of color who wrote the program and did a lot of the emotional and mental labor. And actually, my pastor, Greg Bonfilio, was really great about checking in with me throughout the creation of the series to make sure that I didn't feel like I was overburdened and doing this work unless I truly wanted to. So I had really great support and an ally in him. And actually, when we had first wanted to respond and educate our parish, we had reached out to a prominent Black theologian and asked this person to come and speak via Zoom. And their response was that they're inundated with requests right now. And they very gently but bluntly said, I've put my work out there, and if you want to learn, then read my work. Don't ask me to come in and kind of do that labor for your parish. You need to educate yourselves, and my work is out there.
Thanks for sharing that, Teresa. Yeah. A few other people asked questions, related to pushback and what that looked like specifically with the diocese, and maybe if you could just note on sort of the relationship of St. Ignatius to the diocese as well.
Yeah, we didn't receive a lot of pushback from the diocese itself. As a Jesuit parish, we kind of walk that fine line. I see some nods, so you know what I'm saying. But we have a cordial relationship, especially with the Archbishop. They host some events at our parish, and we're one of the largest donors to the fundraisers to the Archdiocesan Annual Appeal, just given the size of our parish and the demographics of our parish. So we have an okay relationship. I would say the angriest pushback I got was from a deacon in the diocese who was really upset about our use of the word Latinx, and then also upset in general about the program. Again, he's a deacon from the diocese, but wasn't a representative of the diocese.
Those are pretty much the questions that I got from the chat, and I'm certain that I missed a few. So I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions if anyone has a burning question and wanted to unmute and ask Teresa.
Just real quick, someone wrote in the chat, Rosemary said, just a note that Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste is an excellent source for understanding underlying causes. We actually use that resource as well in our series. So great highlight, read the book. It's brilliant. So I saw another question. I told Aaron and Brenna that I was terrible at looking at the chat, but I kind of have my eye on it a little bit. And someone asked about centering BIPOC voices without tokenizing them. That's a really, really great question. And I think should always be on the forefront of anyone's mind when they're doing any sort of racial justice work is not to tokenize a person of color. What we did in our series was to really center the voices of Black theologians and Black historians, Black sociologists who have been doing this work for years and years and years and are the most well-versed. So rather than using our voices, really highlighting theirs. So we quote a lot of people, we pull in resources like CAST, we link to other resources. So we really just wanted to center primarily Black voices.
Thanks. A few additional questions in the chat. After casting such a broad net for participants, do you know how many in the end were parishioners of St. Ignatius?
Yeah, we had about 200. We asked people to identify what institution, if any, they were registering from. Um, so it's nice because we got to see kind of that it really was across the nation and from all other parts, and then got to see who was at our parish.
And what fruits have you seen in your parish from the series?
That is a really great question. I think the fruits are that there's like an urgency and a want to do more. Um, and um, and recognizing that again, it's individual conversion and collective action. Um, so what we're seeing now amongst the commissions is really just kind of a wrestling of how to what is the next step that we should take, and how do we take that with intentionality, and how do we take that again with the idea of individual conversion and collective action. And it's always a part of our conversations. At every leadership night we have on the agenda, what are we going to do in order to achieve our goal of becoming an anti-racist parish, or following along to our strategic plan.
Okay, I have two more brief questions, and then I think we can move on to the reflection portion. But one, someone asked about cost. I do want to confirm that it is a free resource to folks, correct?
It's a free resource, yeah.
And then secondly, someone asked about age groups. So were teens included? Were families part of it, or was it primarily an adult program?
It was primarily an adults program. Again, we didn't ask people to identify their demographics other than the institution that they were a part of. So can't really speak to that, but good question. Something I would look to add in the future for registrations.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Teresa. And thanks
Yeah.
to all of you for your questions.
So what I wanted to do was just lead us through an example of a meditation. I'm not going to pause as long as I would if I were leading this kind of in real time because of our because of the time. You all asked really, really, really great questions. So for this, I just ask that you sit in a comfortable position. Maybe put your feet on the ground. If you're taking notes, put your pen down. And just be in this moment. Listen to your breath as it flows in and out in its regular rhythm. Notice what areas you're holding tension. Notice how your chair feels beneath you, supporting you. Notice any sounds, any smells. Just be in this present moment. As I guide you through this meditation, I'll be using first person language. So I hope that you find that helpful. I ask for the grace to direct all of my actions, intentions, and thoughts to be in service and praise of God. I imagine a great expanse before me. To one end stands Christ our Lord, and on the other, Lucifer. I desire to have insight into how the evil spirit works and deceives, and then to guard myself against it. And I desire further insights into the genuine life that comes from Christ and the grace to imitate him. I imagine the enemy seated on a throne of fire and smoke as he sends countless devils into cities, provinces, states, and individual persons. I consider what the enemy says to his devils, commanding them to set up snares and chains, to tempt people to covet and hoard riches, to set up policies and procedures that ensure the riches of one person or a select few at the expense of countless others. Being tempted with riches, it becomes easier for one to esteem his or herself over others, particularly on the basis of race. The enemy instructs his devils to construct systems to prioritize those with lighter skin over those with darker skin. Having constructed these systems, those ensnared develop a sense of pride for the riches they have accumulated and the esteem they have built. The enemy, using these three temptations of riches, esteem, and pride, then leads people to all other vices. Then in contrast, I gaze upon the other end of the field, and there stands our true leader, Christ our Lord. I imagine how the Lord calls all peoples to be apostles and disciples, then send them all over the world to spread the good news to all people in every state and condition. I consider how Christ speaks lovingly to all his friends he is sending out on this expedition. He instructs them to aid all peoples, first attracting them to spiritual poverty, for blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and a detachment from the trappings of wealth. Then, if they so wish, to serve the divine majesty, to material solidarity with the oppressed, to renounce wealth that comes at the expense of others. Secondly, he asks for those who wish to follow him to desire contempt and insults, so as not to think of oneself as better than another, to desire for a spirit of persecution for the kingdom. Then, having been freed from all material wealth and false honors, Christ's friends leads all people to humility, to seeing all of God's creation imbued with dignity. Using these three steps, spiritual poverty, freedom to accept contempt and insults, and humility, the Spirit leads to all other virtues. Having contemplated these two standards, I now picture sitting with Mary, our mother. I ask for the grace to be taken under Christ's standard. I talk with her about what I just contemplated. I listen for what she has to say. I ask for her help in following Christ. And I listen for what area in my life she is calling me to reflect further. And in my own heart and in my own mind, I end with a Hail Mary. And gently open your eyes, hear those sounds, smell those smells, and welcome ourselves back into this present moment. So now Brenna is going to break us up into small groups for about 10 minutes and just share one highlight from this prior experience. And so this is the website link. I'll drop it in the chat. And then again, stay tuned for the PDF compilation and facilitator's guide. That's probably like a month or two out from being completed. But if you just kind of periodically click on this link, or if you want to sign up for the newsletter, you can go to our main page as well. If you have further questions, I love doing this work, and we'll continue to do so on the high school level. Here is my new email address. I know it's a mouthful because my last name is now a mouthful, but I'll also drop that in the chat while Erin and Brenna are making announcements.